Continuing the varieties of religious experience, a study in human nature by William James. We're in our second program from the lecture on philosophy, which is number 18. And the note that we started on last time was, for convenience's sake, I follow the order of A. Stockel, Lecherbach, der Philosophie, 5th, Auflage, Mainz, 1881, Band 2, B. Boetter, Natural Theology, London, 1891, is a handy Catholic manual, but an almost identical doctrine is given by such Protestant theologians as C. Hodge. Systematic Theology, New York, 1893, or A. H. Strong, Systematic Theology, 5th edition, New York, 1897. The arguments for God's existence have stood for hundreds of years with the waves of unbelieving criticism, breaking against them, never totally discrediting them in the ears of the faithful, but on the whole slowly and surely washing out the mortar from between their joints. If you have a God already whom you believe in, these arguments confirm you. If you are atheistic, they fail to set you right. The proofs are various. The cosmological ones, so-called, reasons from the contingents of the world to a first cause, which must contain whatever perfections the world itself contains. The argument from design reasons from the fact that nature's laws are mathematical and are parts benevolently adopted to each other, and this cause is both intellectual and benevolent. The moral argument is that the moral law presupposes a lawgiver. Well, didn't Nietzsche say that if you say that there is natural law at all, you have to presume a natural lawgiver? So why are you talking about natural law if you're supposed to be atheist? I don't remember exactly how he said it, but the argument ex consensu gentium is that the belief in God is so widespread as to be grounded in the rational nature of man, and should therefore carry authority with it. As I just said, I will not discuss these arguments technically. The bare fact that all idealists, since Kant, have felt entitled either to scout or to neglect them shows that they are not solid enough to serve as religion's all-sufficient foundation. Absolutely impersonal reasons would be in duty bound to show more general convincingness. Causation is indeed too obscure a principle to bear the weight of the whole structure of theology. As for the argument from design, see how Darwinian ideas have revolutionized it. Conceived as we now conceive them, as so many fortunate escapes from almost limitless processes of destruction, the benevolent adaptations which we find in nature suggest a deity very different from the one who figured in the early versions of the argument. It must not be forgotten that any form of disorder in the world might by the design argument suggest a God for just that kind of disorder. The truth is that any state of things, whatever, that can be named is logically susceptible of teleological interpretation. The ruins of the earthquake at Lisbon, for example, the whole of past history had to be planned exactly as it was to bring about in the fullness of time just that particular arrangement of debris, of masonry, furniture, and once living bodies. No other train of causes would have been sufficient, and so of any other arrangement, bad or good, which might, as a matter of fact, been resulting anywhere from previous conditions, to avoid such a pessimistic consequences and save its beneficent designer. The design argument accordingly invokes two other principles, restrictive in their operation. The first is physical. Nature's forces tend of their own accord only to disorder and destruction, to heaps of ruins, not to architecture. This principle, though plausible at first sight, seems in the light of recent biology to be more and more improbable. The second principle is one of anthropomorphic interpretation. No arrangement that for us is disorderly can possibly have been an object of design at all. This principle is, of course, a mere assumption in the interest of anthropomorphic theism, When one views the world with no definite theological basis, a bias, well, it's typically what people mean, right? Like they're synonyms. Like if it's theological basis, it really is bias. Anyways, no definite theological bias, one way or the other, sees that order and disorder, as we now recognize them, are purely human inventions. We are interested in certain types of arrangement, useful, aesthetic, or moral. So interested that whenever we find them realized, the fact emphatically rivets our attention. The result is that we work over the contents of the world selectively. It is overflowing with disorderly arrangement from our point of view, but order is the only thing we care for and look at, and by choosing, one can always find some sort of orderly arrangement in the midst of any chaos. If I should throw down 1,000 beans at random upon a table, I could doubtless, by eliminating a sufficient number of them, leave the rest in almost any geometrical pattern you might propose to me, and you might then say that the pattern was the thing prefigured beforehand, and that the other beans were mere irrelevance and packing material. Our dealings with nature are just this. She is a vast plenum in which our attention draws capricious lines in innumerable directions. We count and name whatever lies upon the special lines we trace, whilst the other things in the untraced lines are neither named nor counted. There are in reality infinitely more things unadapted to each other in this world than there are things adapted. Infinitely more things with irregular relations than with regular relations between them. But we look for the regular kind of that thing exclusively, and ingeniously discover and preserve it in our memory. It accumulates with other regular kinds, until the collection of them fills our encyclopedias, yet all the while between and around them lies an infinite, anonymous chaos of objects that no one ever thought of together, of relations that never yet attracted our attention, the facts of order from which the physico-theological argument starts, are thus easily susceptible of interpretation as arbitrary human products. So long as this is the case, although of course no argument against God follows, it follows that the argument for him will fail to constitute a knockdown proof of his existence. It will be convincing only to those who on other grounds believe in him already. The fact is that these arguments do but follow the combined suggestions of the facts and of our feeling. They prove nothing rigorously. They only corroborate our pre-existent partialities. If philosophy can do so little to establish God's existence, how astounds it with her efforts to define his attributes? It is worthwhile to look at the attempts of systematic theology in this direction. Since God is the first cause, this science of sciences says he differs from all his creatures in possessing existence, say, from this satiety on God's part. Theology deduces, by mere logic, most of his other perfections. For instance, he must be both necessary and absolute. Cannot be, and cannot in any way be determined by anything else. This makes him absolutely unlimited from without, and unlimited also from within, for limitation is non-being, and God is being itself. This unlimitedness makes God infinitely perfect. Moreover, God is one and only, for the infinitely perfect can admit no peer. He is spiritual, for were he composed of physical parts, some other power would have to combine them into the total, and his aseity would thus be contradicted. He is therefore both simple and non-physical in nature. He is simple metaphysically, so that is to say his nature and existence cannot be distinct, as they are finite substances which share their formal natures with one another, and are individual only in the material aspect. Well, at least not, you could speak of the qualities of God, but not the essence of God, right? But that doesn't mean the persona of God is, is it the id? Is it the id we're talking about, the essence? But it's not the personage, the personages bit of the Christian doctrine. Share formal natures of an individual only in the material aspect. Well, God isn't. Okay, but Since God is one and only, his essentia and his esse must be given at one stroke. I thought white people weren't supposed to say essay. Well, actually, it's racist to say that there's any word or whatever that people can't use, right? Because of the color they are. Their formal natures with one another. Okay. This excludes from his being all those distinctions so familiar in the world of finite things between potentiality and actuality, substance and accidents, being and activity, existence and attributes. We can talk, it is true, of God's powers, acts, and attributes, but these discriminations are only virtual and made from the human point of view. In God, all these points of view fall into an absolute identity of being. This absence of all potentiality in God obliges him to be immutable. He is actuality through and through. Were there anything potential about him, he would either lose or gain by its actualization, and neither loss or gain would contradict his perfection. He cannot therefore change. Furthermore, he is immense, boundless. For could he be outlined in space, he would be composite, and this would contradict his indivisibility. He is therefore omnipresent, indivisibly there at every point of space. He is similarly wholly present at every point of time, in other words, eternal. Where if he began in time, he would need a prior case, and that would contradict his aseity. If he ended, it would contradict his necessity. If he went through any succession, it would contradict his immutability. He has intelligence and will and every other creature perfection, for we have them, and effectus nequit superare causum in him. However, there are absolutely and eternally in act, and their object, since God can be bound by naught that is external, can primarily be nothing else than God himself. He knows himself then in one eternal, indivisible act, and wills himself with an infinite self-pleasure. For the scholastics, facultas, appetende, embraces feeling, desire, and will. And remember the experience I shared when I figured out I had a soul. Well, I mean, I believe I had a soul, but it's different when you know it. And yeah, this sensual being, the physicality, that's there. The emotions, that's another vehicle. The intellect, that's another vehicle. And really the will, you can experience the will like it's something different too. That's why in the tarot you got your 4 suits, and the fire suit is the will, but the spirit soul, the stations that you're at, because everything in the pips, for example, are states. The court cards are, the court cards are states. So, those the trump cards are your spiritual. I mean, as not your what the rest of it's all a vehicle for. The spirit soul stations, Didn't articulate that one too well all the day. Since he must of logical necessity thus love and will himself, he cannot be called free ad intra with the freedom of contrarieties. That characterizes finite creatures. Ad extra, however, or with respect to his creation, God is free. He cannot need to create, being perfect in being and in happiness already. He wills to create then by an absolute freedom. Being thus a substance endowed with intellect and will and freedom, God is a person and a living person also, where he is both object and subject of his own activity, and to be thus this distinguishes the living from the lifeless. He is thus absolutely self-sufficient. His self-knowledge and self-love are both of them infinite and adequate, and need no extraneous conditions to perfect them. He is omniscient, for in knowing himself as cause, he knows all creatures, things, and events by implication. His knowledge is pervasive, for he is present to all time. The whole Vishnu bit, right? Even all our free acts are known beforehand to him, for otherwise his wisdom would admit of successive moments of enrichment, and this would contradict his immutability. He is omnipotent for everything that does not involve logical contradiction. He can make being, in other words, his power includes creation. If what he creates were made of his own substance, it would have to be infinite in essence, as that substance is, but it is finite, so it must be non-divine in substance. If it were made of a substance, an eternally existing matter, for example, which God found there to his hand, and to which he simply gave it its form, that would contradict God's definition as first cause and make him a mere mover of something caused already. The things he creates, then, he creates ex nihilo, and gives them absolute being as so many finite substances additional to himself. The forms which he imprints upon them have their prototypes in his ideas, but as in God there is no such thing as multiplicity, and as these ideas for us are manifold, we must distinguish the ideas as they are in God, and the way in which our minds externally imitate them. We must attribute them to him only in a terminative sense, as differing aspects from the finite point of view of his unique essence. God, of course, is wholly good and just. He can do no evil, for he is positive being's fullness, and evil is negation. It is true that he has created physical evil in places, but only as a means of wider good, for bonum tatius paraeminent bonum partis. Moral evil he cannot will, either as ends or means, for that would contradict his holiness. By creating free beings, he permits it only. Neither his justice nor his goodness obliging him to prevent the recipients of freedom from misusing his gift. Now, physical evil is a Christian concept for the most part. I don't know of anybody that's not Christian or Jew or following the influence of them that believes in evil being created. Unless you follow the Zervan cosmology, then I guess that kind of predates that, where they believe in two deities, and one deity is the evil deity that, well, they don't believe that one's the god, but come on, if it's the creator and all that stuff, you're really, you don't have to call something God for it to be like your God, right? But in monotheism, the idea is that God creates, and some beings just choose to do evil with what's there, right? As regards God's purpose in creating, primarily it can only have been to exercise his absolute freedom by the manifestation of others to his glory. From this, it follows that the others must be rational beings, capable in the first place of knowledge, love, and honor, in the second place of happiness, for the knowledge and love of God is the mainspring of felicity. In so far forth, one may say that God's secondary purpose in creating is love. I will not weary you by pursuing these metaphysical determinations further into the mysteries of God's Trinity, for example. What I have given will serve as a specimen of orthodox philosophical theology of both Catholics and Protestants. Newman, filled with enthusiasm at God's list of perfections, continues the passage which I began to quote you by a couple of pages from a rhetoric so magnificent that I can hardly refrain from adding them in spite of the inroad they would make upon our time. Options, Discourse 3, number 7. He first enumerates God's attributes sonorously, then celebrates his ownership of everything in the earth and heaven, and the dependence of all that happens upon his permissive will. It gives us scholastic philosophy, touched with emotion, and every philosophy should be touched with emotion to be rightly understood. Emotionally, then, dogmatic theology is worth something to minds of the type of Newman's. It will aid us to estimate what it is worth intellectually. If at this point I make a short digression, what God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. The continental schools of philosophy have too often overlooked the fact that man's thinking is organically connected with his conduct. It seems to me to be the chief glory of English and Scottish thinkers to have kept the organic connection in view. And when I include something that's Celtic, that's, from the past 500 years, that is something that I'm going to include in that, right? A spirituality that includes, the physical world, embraces it, The guiding principle of British philosophy has in fact been that every difference must make a difference. Every theoretical difference somewhere issue in a practical difference. Well, for one person or another, they may not figure it out, or it may not be for them, right? So that doesn't. And that the best method of discussing points of theory is to begin by ascertaining what practical difference would result from one alternative or the other being true. What is the particular truth in question known as, and what facts does it result? What is its cash value in terms of particular experience? This is the characteristic English way of taking up a question. In this way, you remember, Locke takes up the question of personal identity. What you mean by it is just your chain of particular memories, says he. That is the only concretely verifiable part of its significance. All further ideas about it, such as the oneness or manyness of the spiritual substance on which it is based, are therefore void of intelligible meaning, and propositions touching such ideas may be indifferentially affirmed or denied. So Berkeley, with his matter, the cash value of matter is our physical sensations. That is what is known us, all that we concretely verify of its conception. That therefore is the whole meaning of the term matter. Any other pretended meaning is mere wind of words. Hume does the same thing with causation. It is known as habitual antecedence, and as tendency on our part to look for something definite to come. Apart from this practical meaning, it has no significance whatever, and books about it may be committed to the flames, says Hume. Douglas Stewart and Thomas Brown and James Miller, John Mill and Professor Bain have followed more or less consistently the same method, and Shadworth Hodgson has used the principle with full explicitness. When all is said and done, it was English and Scottish writers, and not Kant, who introduced the critical method into philosophy. The one method fitted to make philosophy a study worthy of serious men. For what seriousness can possibly remain in debating philosophic propositions that will never make an appreciable difference to us in action? And what could it matter if all propositions were practically indifferent, which of them we should agree to call true or which false? An American philosopher of eminent originality, Mr. Charles Sanders Peirce, has rendered the thought a service by disentangling from the particulars of its application the principle by which these men were instinctively guided, and by singling it out as fundamental and giving to it a Greek name. He calls it the principle of pragmatism, and he defends it somewhat as follows. And from an article, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, in the Popular Science Monthly for January 1878, Volume 12, page 286. Thought in movement has for its only conceivable motive the attainment of belief, our thought at rest. Only when our thought about a subject has found its rest in belief can our action on the subject firmly and safely begin. Beliefs, in short, are rules for action, and the whole function of thinking is but one step in the production of active habits. If there were any part of a thought that made no difference in the thought's practical consequences, then that part would be no proper element of the thought's significance. To develop a thought's meaning, we need therefore only to determine what conduct is fitting to produce. That conduct is for its sole significance, and the tangible fact at the root of all our thought distinctions is that there is no one of them so fine as to consist in anything but a possible difference of practice. To attain perfect clearness in our thoughts of an object, we need then only consider what sensations, immediate or remote, we are conceivably to expect from it, and what conduct we must prepare in case the object should be true. Our conception of these practical consequences is for us the whole of our conception of the object, so far as that conception has positive significance at all. This is the principle of Peirce, the principle of pragmatism, Such a principle will help us on this occasion to decide among the various attributes set down in the scholastic inventory on God's perfections, whether some be not far less significant than others. If namely we apply the principles of pragmatism to God's metaphysical attributes, strictly so called, as distinguished from his moral attributes, I think that even we were forced by a coercive logic to believe them, we still should have to confess them to be destitute of all intelligible significance. Take God's aseity, for example, or his necessariness, his immateriality, his simplicity, or superiority to the kind of inner variety and succession which we find in finite beings, his indivisibility and lack of the inner distinctions of being and activity, substance and accident, potentiality and actuality, and the rest, his repudiation of the inclusion in a genius, his actualized infinity, his personality apart from the moral qualities which it may comport, his relations to evil being permissive and not positive, his self-sufficiency, self-love, and absolute felicity in himself. Candidly speaking, how do such qualities as these make any definite connection with our life? And if they severely call for no distinctive adaptations of our conduct, what vital difference can it possibly make to a man's religion, whether they be true or false? For my own part, although I dislike to say aught that may grate upon tender associations, I must frankly confess that even though these attributes were faultlessly deduced, I cannot conceive of its being of the smallest consequence to us religiously that any one of them should be true. Pray, what specific act can I perform in order to adapt myself the better to God's simplicity? Or how does it assist me to plan my behavior, to know that his happiness is anyhow absolutely complete? In the middle of the century just past, Mayne Reid was the great writer of books of out-of-door adventure. He was forever extolling the hunters and field observers of living animal habits, and keeping up a fire of invective against the closet naturalists, as he called them, the collectors and classifiers and handlers of skeletons and skins. When I was a boy, I used to think that a closet naturalist must be the vilest type of wretch under the sun. But surely the systematic theologians are the closet naturalists of the deity, even in Captain Mayne Reid's sense. What is their deduction of metaphysical attributes but a shuffling and matching of pedantic dictionary adjectives, aloof from morals, aloof from human needs, something that might be worked out from the mere word God by one of those logical machines of wood and brass which recent ingenuity has contrived, as well as by a man of flesh and blood? They have the trail of the serpent over them. One feels that in the theologian's hands they are only a set of titles attained by mechanical manipulation of synonyms. Verbality has stepped into the place of vision, professionalism into that of life. Instead of bread, we have a stone. Instead of a fish, a serpent. Did such a conglomeration of abstract terms give really the gist of our knowledge of the deity? Schools of theology might indeed continue to flourish, but religion, vital religion, would have taken its flight from the world. What keeps religion going is something else than abstract definitions and systems of concatenated adjectives. And something different from faculties of theology and their professors. Of all these things are after effects, the secondary applications upon these phenomena of vital conversation with the unseen divine, of which I have shown you so many instances renewing themselves in sacula saculorum in the lives of humble private men. So much for the metaphysical attributes of God. From the point of view of practical religion, the metaphysical monster which they offer to our worship is an absolutely worthless invention of the scholarly mind. Well, that's overstating it, but, don't require your elaborations on other people, right? I mean, if someone wants to join me in my voluntary stuff that I do, whether it's taught to me from someone else or whatever, fine. But I'm not going to require it. I'm not going to say my personal elaborations on any matter are, universals. And if I'm wrong, go ahead, correct me. I want to find it. I want to be right. I don't want to continue being wrong, just to, keep myself out there or something, address me. I'll publicly correct myself if I see things proven. What shall we say now of the attributes called moral? Pragmatically, they stand on an entirely different footing. They positively determine fear and hope and expectation, and are foundations for the saintly life. It needs but a glance at them to show how great is their significance. God's holiness, for example, being holy, God will nothing but the good. Being omnipotent, he can secure its triumph. Being omniscient, he can see us in the dark. Being just, he can punish us for what he sees. Being loving, he can pardon too. Being unalterable, we can count on him securely. These qualities enter into connection with our life. It is highly important that we should be informed concerning them. That God's purpose in creation should be the manifestation of his glory is also an attribute which has definite relations to our practical life. Among other things, it is given a definite character to worship in all Christian countries. If dogmatic theology really does prove beyond dispute that a God with characters like these exists, she may well claim to give a solid basis to religious sentiment. But verily, how stands it with their argument? And by she, they mean that's how the church is spoken of, because the church is run by males, and so they're forming a relationship with the female. But then again, Jesus, you got this all-male Trinity. This cat's yelling at me. It stands with them as ill as with the arguments for his existence. Not only do post-Kantian idealists reject them, root and branch, but it is a plain historical fact that they never have converted anyone who has found in the moral complexion of the world, as he experienced it, reasons for doubting that a good God can have framed it. To prove God's goodness by the scholastic argument that there is no non-being in his essence would sound to such a witness simply silly. No, the book of Job went over this whole matter once for all and definitively. Well, then why did they edit the book of Job? Yeah, edited less than a lot of the books, and say there is a definitive scripture. While that definitive scripture in any respect would still allow for experience and understanding and various things not explicit to the text being discovered, even if everything per se would have to turn back to it, it still doesn't mean entirely as the conservatives tend to lead us to believe. But ratiocination is a relatively superficial and unreal path to the deity. O lay mine hand upon my mouth, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee, an intellect perplexed and baffled, yet a trustful sense of presence. Such is the situation of the man who is sincere with himself and with the facts, but who remains religious still. Pragmatically, the most important attribute of God is his punitive justice, but who in the present state of theological opinion on that point will dare maintain that hellfire or its equivalent in some shape is rendered certain by pure logic? Theology herself has largely based this doctrine upon revelation, and in discussing it, it has tended more and more to substitute conventional ideas of criminal law for a priori principles of reason. But the very notion that this glorious universe with planets and winds and laughing sky and ocean should have been conceived and had its beams and rafters laid in technicalities of criminality is incredible to our modern imagination. It weakens a religion to hear it argued upon such a basis. We must therefore, I think, bid a definitive goodbye to dogmatic theology. In all sincerity, our faith must do without that warrant. Modern idealism, I repeat, has said goodbye to this theology forever. Can modern idealism give a faith better warrant, or must she still rely on her poor self for witness? The basis of modern idealism is Kant's doctrine of the transcendental ego of a perception. By this formidable term, Kant merely meant the fact that the consciousness, I think them, must potentially or actually accompany all our objects. Former skeptics had said as much, but the I in question had remained for them identified with the personal individual. Kant abstracted and depersonalized it, and made it the most universal of all his categories. Although for Kant himself the transcendental ego had no theological implications, it was reserved for his successors to convert Kant's notion of Bewusstsein, Überhaupt, or abstract consciousness, into an infinite concrete self-consciousness, which is the soul of the world and which our sundry personal self-consciousnesses have their being. It would lead me into technicalities to show you even briefly how this transformation was in point of fact effected. Suffice it to say that in the Hegelian school, which today so deeply influences both British and American thinking, two principles have borne the brunt of this operation. The first of these principles is that old logic of identity never gives us more than a post-mortem dissection of a disjecta membra, and that the fullness of life can be construed to thought only by recognizing that every object which our thought may propose to itself involves the notion of some other object which seems at first to negate the first one. The second principle is that to be conscious of a negation is already virtually to be beyond it. The mere asking of a question or expression of a dissatisfaction proves that the answer or satisfaction is already imminent. The finite realized as such is already the infinite in posse. Applying these principles, we seem to get a propulsive force into our logic, which the ordinary logic of a bare, stark self-identity in each thing never attains to. The objects of our thought now act within our thought, act as objects, act when given an experience. They change and develop. They introduce something other than themselves along with them, and this other, at first only ideal or potential, presently proves itself also to be actual. It supersedes the thing at first supposed, and both verifies and corrects it in developing the fullness of its meaning. The program is excellent. The universe is a place where things are followed by other things that both correct and fulfill them. And a logic which gave us something like this movement of fact would express truth far better than the traditional school logic, which never gets of its own accord from anything to anything else and registers only predictions and assumptions or static resemblances and differences. Nothing could be more like the methods of dogmatic theology than those of this new logic. Let me quote in illustration some passages from the Scottish transcendentalists, whom I have already named. How are we to conceive, Principal Caird writes, of the reality in which all intelligence rests? He replies, two things may, without difficulty, be proved: that this reality is an absolute spirit, and conversely that it is only in communion with this absolute spirit or intelligence that the finite spirit can realize itself. It is absolute, for the faintest movement of human intelligence would be arrested if it did not presuppose the absolute reality of intelligence, of thought itself. Doubt or denial themselves presuppose and indirectly affirm it. When I pronounce anything to be true, I pronounce it, indeed, to be relative to thought, but not to be relative to my thought, or to the thought of any other individual mind. From the existence of all individual minds, such as I can abstract, I can think them away. But that which I cannot think away is thought or self-consciousness itself. In its independence and absoluteness, or in other words, an absolute thought or self-consciousness. Here you see Principal Caird makes the transition which Kant did not make. He converts the omnipresence of consciousness in general as a condition of truth, being anywhere possible, to an omnipresent universal consciousness, which he identifies with God in his concreteness. He next proceeds to use the principle that to acknowledge your limits is in essence to be beyond them, and makes the transition to the religious experience of individuals in the following words, which we'll get into in program 3 of this, and the cat crawling on me here.